Heart Story sends warm greetings to you. Some gestures are so small, they vanish beneath the morning light, unless you know where to look. In the quiet town of Fayridge, Eleanor Hayes, a widow in her late 70s, had kept the same ritual for years. Every morning at exactly 6:45, she placed a steaming cup of black coffee on the front porch railing, no sugar, no cream. It was never meant for her. It had always been for Henry, her husband. A Marine who had returned from war but never quite left it behind. Since his passing 5 years ago, Eleanor had kept the habit alive. "Old soldiers deserve a warm cup," she'd whisper, as though he were still listening. Neighbors assumed it was a tender way of mourning. Most never asked. But Eleanor didn't do it for attention. It was just love, routine, simple, and steady. Until one November morning, something changed. The coffee disappeared. Eleanor blinked at the empty spot where the cup had been. At first, she thought perhaps it had tipped over or the wind had knocked it down, but the porch was clean, no spill, no shattered glass, nothing. Instead, in its place, sat a small, round metal coin. She picked it up carefully. It was a challenge coin, military-issued, engraved with a Marine Corps emblem and a date, June 3, 1968. Her heart skipped. That was the day Henry had saved 2 fellow soldiers during an ambush in Vietnam, an event he never spoke about, but which surfaced once in a letter, folded and hidden in a drawer she had since memorized. Beneath the coin lay a folded scrap of paper, yellowed at the edges. In precise, blocky handwriting, it read, "He kept his promise. Now it's our turn." Eleanor's hand trembled. Someone out there still remembered Henry, not just as a husband, but as a brother in arms. That evening, as dusk painted the porch in hues of gold and shadow, Eleanor sat in her usual spot, the challenge coin resting in her palm. She stared down the quiet street, unsure what to expect, but her heart pulsed with a strange anticipation. At precisely 6:45, she heard slow, steady footsteps approaching from the sidewalk. Rising from her chair, she opened the screen door just as 3 men emerged from the fading light. They wore plain clothes, wool coats, worn boots, but each bore a distinct stillness in their posture. One of them, tall and square-shouldered, wore a faded Marine Corps cap. None spoke. Instead, as they reached the steps, all 3 stood at attention and raised their right hands in a silent, solemn salute. Whoever they were, they didn't need words. Their presence said it all. They had come for him, and for her. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice trembling. "You knew Henry, didn't you?" The tallest of the 3 nodded once, then reached into his coat pocket and handed her a small, weathered envelope. Her name was written on it in familiar block letters, Henry's handwriting. She hadn't seen it in years. Her hands shook as she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, dated months before Henry's death. It began simply. Eleanor's breath caught. She hadn't seen that gesture since Henry's funeral. Her throat tightened. "If this ever reaches you, it means they kept their word." Tears welled in her eyes as she read. The letter spoke of 3 men, Carter, Miguel, and Ray, his brothers from the battlefield. Henry wrote of a pact they had made long ago: if anything ever happened to one of them, the others would visit their loved ones, not with flowers or fanfare, but with silence and presence, the kind only soldiers understood. As she lowered the letter, the men stood still, eyes steady. The promise made in war had reached her doorstep. Eleanor invited the 3 men inside, her voice barely more than a whisper. They entered slowly, respectfully, as if crossing into sacred ground. The living room was warm, filled with soft lamplight and the scent of cinnamon tea. Above the mantel hung a framed photo of Henry in uniform, young, proud, unshaken. The men paused before it, removing their caps. One of them, Carter, finally spoke. "We were with him that day. June 3, 1968. His voice was deep, raspy. He saved our lives. Miguel nodded. He dragged us both from the riverbank while under fire. Took a bullet through the shoulder but never stopped moving. Ray added, we swore we'd return the favor. And we tried, but he never told us where to find you. Not until recently. Eleanor clutched the letter in her hands. He wrote about that day, just once. Carter looked her in the eye. Then you know he didn't just save us. He carried us. Eleanor's eyes glistened as she looked at the men seated around her modest kitchen table. There was something deeply grounding about their presence, something quiet but unshakable. She poured them coffee without asking how they liked it. Somehow, she already knew. As they sipped, Carter pulled a small box from his satchel and slid it across the table. Henry asked us to give you this. He said you'd know when the time was right. Inside was a folded handkerchief, meticulously pressed. Wrapped within it lay a silver dog tag and a tiny velvet pouch. Eleanor opened it to reveal a gold band, Henry's wedding ring. Her hand flew to her mouth. He lost this during his last deployment. He said it slipped into the river. Miguel smiled gently. He found it the day before the ambush. But he gave it to us instead, told us to guard it until we could deliver it home. The circle had closed, quietly, faithfully. The next morning, Eleanor rose before sunrise, her heart heavy but settled. She brewed a fresh pot of coffee and placed 4 cups on the porch, one for Henry, and one for each of the men who had carried part of him back to her. Carter, Miguel, and Ray arrived without a word, each tipping his head as they took their seats. The steam from the coffee mingled with the cool morning air, and for a while, they sat in silence. Then Eleanor broke it. He never talked much about the war. But he always stared at the porch during breakfast. Said it was the only place that made him feel whole. Ray nodded. That was Henry. He never glorified what we did. He just held the weight of it quietly. Carter added, he said this porch was his peace. So we figured, it was time we brought part of that peace back to you. And in that shared stillness, healing began. As the morning sun climbed higher, Carter reached into his coat and handed Eleanor a faded leather journal. Its cover was cracked with age, the corners frayed, but Henry's initials were still pressed into the spine. Eleanor's breath caught. He told me he burned all his journals. Carter shook his head gently. He burned the ones with pain. This was for you. She opened it slowly. The first page read, for Eleanor, when I can no longer speak it aloud. Inside were short entries, snippets of porch conversations, sketches of her silhouette in the doorway, fragments of poetry he had never dared recite. Miguel whispered, he carried that journal through rain, mud, and fire. Said it was his way of keeping you close. Eleanor's fingers traced every word as if touching his voice. Each page breathed with his love, not for the battlefield, but for home. Through tears, she whispered, he never really left. The final pages of the journal held something different, maps. Not military diagrams, but hand-drawn sketches of places Eleanor and Henry had once dreamed of visiting, the Oregon coast, a cabin near Lake Superior, a narrow street in Charleston where they once danced beneath the rain. At the bottom of the last page, Henry had written, if I don't make it back, promise me you'll still go. Even without me, go feel the wind we talked about. Eleanor closed the journal slowly, pressing it to her chest. For years, she had stayed rooted in that house, anchored by memory and loss. But now, Henry's words nudged her gently forward. Miguel looked at her kindly. He wanted you to live, not just remember. Ray added, we could drive you. One stop at a time. Eleanor looked at the 3 men, once strangers, now keepers of a shared soul. And for the first time in years, she whispered, maybe it's time. A week later, Eleanor stood on her porch, suitcase in hand, as a navy blue pickup truck pulled up to the curb. Carter was driving, Miguel riding shotgun, and Ray climbed out from the back seat with a smile that felt like home. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the porch where so many memories lingered. Then she looked down at the journal in her hand, the pages now marked with bookmarks and folded corners. As she stepped toward the truck, Ray opened the door for her. "First stop?" he asked gently. She nodded. "The coast." Henry always said the waves there sounded like laughter. The ride was quiet at first, but comforting. They passed through small towns and open roads, the world widening outside her window. With every mile, Eleanor felt a layer of stillness begin to lift. Henry's voice echoed in her memory, "Go feel the wind." And finally, she was. By the time they reached the Oregon coast, the sun was beginning to set, casting amber light across the water. The four of them stood together at the edge of the cliffs, the wind tousling Eleanor's silver hair. She closed her eyes and listened. The sound of waves crashing below was deep, rhythmic, alive. Carter handed her a small tin box Henry had once carried in his rucksack. Inside were pebbles, pressed leaves, and a note labeled, "For the ocean." Eleanor opened it slowly. The note was short: "Scatter these pieces wherever you find peace. Then stay a while." One by one, she dropped the items into the sea breeze, watching them float and fall. It felt like a release, not of grief, but of waiting. Miguel stood beside her and whispered, "He wanted you to feel this. The world, the wind, it's still yours." She took a deep breath, the salt air filling her lungs like a second chance. That night, they stayed at a quiet seaside inn, tucked away between windswept dunes and crooked pine trees. Eleanor sat on the porch in a borrowed sweater, watching moonlight dance across the waves. The journal lay open on her lap, a blank page fluttering in the breeze. For the first time, she picked up a pen. With a slow, steady hand, she wrote, "Today, I stood in the wind you always described." It didn't feel like goodbye, it felt like finally arriving. Inside, the men played cards, their voices muffled but warm through the windowpane. They weren't just old soldiers anymore, they were friends, companions on a journey she never knew she needed. Eleanor closed the journal and held it to her chest. The ache was still there, but it had softened. In that moment, with salt in the air and peace in her bones, she realized something powerful. Henry had sent them not just to honor the past, but to guide her into what came next. Their next stop was a quiet cabin tucked near Lake Superior, a place Henry had once described as, "where the trees breathe louder than people." The path there was lined with golden leaves and the scent of pine. As the truck pulled into the gravel drive, Eleanor felt a rush of emotion. This had been their dream retirement getaway. The cabin had aged, but so had she. Inside, dust blanketed the windowsills, yet sunlight poured in like an old friend. Carter lit a fire while Ray unpacked a small box of groceries. Miguel handed Eleanor a folded piece of paper, Henry's sketch of this very cabin, drawn decades ago from memory. "It was always in his mind," Miguel said. "Even when we were overseas." Eleanor walked to the back porch, the lake stretching before her like a mirror of time. She whispered, "We made it, Henry." In that stillness, the dream they had shelved was finally being lived, step by quiet step. That evening, Eleanor found herself flipping through the journal once more. Tucked near the middle was a page marked with a dried fern leaf, fragile, perfectly preserved. Next to it, Henry had scribbled, "If she ever gets here, remind her to dance." She smiled, half laughing, half crying. "Dance?" she said aloud. The room echoed with quiet warmth. Carter overheard and raised an eyebrow. "Dance?" Eleanor held up the page. "Apparently, my husband left instructions." Without hesitation, Miguel reached into his duffel and pulled out a small, portable radio. With a few turns of the dial, an old Nat King Cole song crackled to life, soft, nostalgic, timeless. Ray stood and offered his hand. "May I?" She laughed and took it. There, in the middle of the cabin's worn wooden floor, Eleanor danced for the first time in years. It wasn't about steps, it was about remembering how to feel weightless again. And in that moment, she did. As the song faded and laughter settled into silence, Eleanor stood still for a moment, her hands still clasped in Ray's. The room had changed, not in appearance, but in spirit. It no longer felt like a cabin filled with strangers. It felt like home. She stepped outside to catch her breath, the lake shimmering under the moonlight. In the distance, loons called softly. She remembered how Henry once said their sound reminded him of prayer, low, haunting, full of longing. From her pocket, she pulled out a small stone Henry had once carried from the shore during training. He kept it not for beauty, but for weight, a grounding presence. Eleanor bent down, kissed the stone, and gently tossed it into the lake. Not to let go, but to give back. To return a part of him to the places they had dreamed together. The ripples faded, but the peace remained. Tomorrow, they would head south. But tonight, she had found stillness. As the song faded and laughter settled into silence, Eleanor stood still for a moment, her hands still clasped in Ray's. The room had changed, not in appearance, but in spirit. It no longer felt like a cabin filled with strangers. It felt like home. Distance, loons called softly. She remembered how Henry once said their sound reminded him of prayer, low, haunting, full of longing. From her pocket, she pulled out a small stone Henry had once carried from the shore during training. She stepped outside to catch her breath, the lake shimmering under the moonlight. In the kept it not for beauty, but for weight, a grounding presence. Eleanor bent down, kissed the stone, and gently tossed it into the lake. Not to let go, but to give back. To return a part of him to the places they had dreamed together. The ripples faded, but the peace remained. Tomorrow, they would head south. But tonight, she had found stillness. Their journey next brought them to Charleston, South Carolina, a city Henry had spoken of with a wistful smile. Cobblestone streets, live oaks, and music that seeps through the shutters, he once told Eleanor. As they arrived, the city was just waking up, bathed in golden morning light. Eleanor walked slowly down a narrow alley Henry had described in one of his old letters, the one where they had once danced in the rain during their honeymoon. The alley was still there, vines curling over wrought iron balconies, and somewhere nearby, a jazz trio played softly from a corner cafe. She paused, touched the brick wall, and smiled. "You remembered the rhythm of this place," she whispered. Carter handed her another envelope, found tucked behind the sketch in Henry's journal. Inside was a ticket stub from a 1971 jazz concert and a note, "If you find this, it means I never forgot." Neither had she. Later that day, Eleanor and the men visited White Point Garden, a peaceful park near the water's edge lined with cannons, moss-covered oaks, and benches that had weathered both storms and stories. They sat beneath one of the trees Henry had mentioned in his journal, the one that leans like it's listening. There, Miguel pulled a crumpled envelope from his jacket. "He asked us to wait until Charleston," he said. Eleanor opened the letter slowly. It wasn't a message, but a poem, one Henry had written for her long ago but never shared. The final lines read, "If one day I'm gone and the music remains, find the echo in the rain, and dance again." She read it aloud, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. Locals passed by, pausing respectfully, sensing the sacred air around them. Carter murmured, even in silence, he knew how to speak. And in that moment, the park didn't just hold history, it held memory. That evening, they returned to a small inn tucked between two historic row houses. The hallway smelled of lavender and old wood, and from the open windows came the soft hum of a violinist playing in the distance. Eleanor sat at the writing desk by the window, lit only by a flickering candle. She opened Henry's journal once more and found a blank page near the back. Slowly, she began to write, not to Henry, but for him. Today I stood where we once danced. I wasn't alone. You sent them, didn't you? Sent them to walk with me, because you knew I'd never go otherwise. She paused, letting the tears fall freely now, not from pain, but from the deep fullness of remembering. Just then, a soft knock at the door. It was Ray, holding a tiny record player. We found it at the market, he smiled. Nat King Cole again? Eleanor nodded. Let's play it. Just one more time. The next morning, as mist rolled in from the harbor, Eleanor sat at a cafe near the waterfront, cradling a cup of strong black coffee, the same way Henry had always taken his. Across from her, Carter unfolded a faded newspaper clipping he'd carried for years. It featured a grainy black and white photo of 4 young Marines standing shoulder to shoulder, their eyes solemn, their uniforms crisp. There we were, Carter said, tapping the image. Vietnam, just after the river ambush. Henry made us swear, we'd live full lives, and we'd bring the story back to you someday. Eleanor studied the photo, her eyes lingering on Henry's face, so young, yet already carrying the weight of men twice his age. Ray added, he wasn't just brave. He was steady. When others panicked, he was already moving. Miguel leaned in. And every time we laughed after the war, it was because he made sure we could. Eleanor nodded slowly. Then let's make sure the world remembers, too. Later that afternoon, the group visited a small veterans memorial tucked behind a local church, an unassuming place Henry had once mentioned with reverence. Eleanor stepped quietly toward the stone wall etched with names, her fingers grazing the cool surface as if searching for his presence in the granite. Carter spoke with a church volunteer and returned with surprising news. They're holding a local remembrance ceremony tomorrow. They've offered to include Henry's name in the roll call. Would you like that? Eleanor paused, emotions swirling. He never sought the spotlight, she said softly. But if it reminds someone else to listen when a soldier speaks, or when he stays silent, then yes, let him be heard. The next morning, as the names were read one by one, Eleanor stood beside Carter, Miguel, and Ray. When Henry's name echoed through the courtyard, the 3 men raised their hands in salute. And Eleanor placed her hand over her heart, because that's where he had always lived. After the ceremony, a young woman approached Eleanor holding a small camera and notebook. I'm a local journalist, she said gently. May I ask who you were honoring today? Eleanor glanced at the 3 men behind her before answering. My husband. Henry Hayes. Marine. Quiet hero. The journalist's eyes lit with curiosity. Would you be willing to share his story? Miguel stepped forward. It's not just his story. It's ours too. Within an hour, they were seated beneath a willow tree, telling tales of foxholes and fire, laughter and loss. The young woman listened closely, taking notes as fast as her pen could move. Later that week, the article appeared in the Sunday edition, 3 salutes and a cup of coffee, 1 widow. Neighbors stopped Eleanor in the grocery store, strangers left flowers on her porch, and the town remembered a man who had never asked to be Henry's silence had finally found its voice. Back in Fayridge, the autumn leaves had begun to fall, covering Eleanor's porch in shades of gold and rust. She stood in the doorway, looking out at the familiar street, the empty cup of coffee once again resting on the railing, only this time, not as a symbol of grief, but of gratitude. Miguel, Carter, and Ray had departed a day earlier, leaving behind handshakes, quiet tears, and promises to return. They hadn't just brought her Henry's memories, they had given her a living connection to him, one forged in shared silence and deep understanding. Eleanor sat on the porch swing, Henry's journal in her lap. The last page now bore her handwriting, he kept his promise. And so did they. And now, so will I. As the sun dipped low, she poured a second cup beside her own. Not for mourning, but for remembering. Because some loves don't fade, they echo, quietly, in the footsteps of those who show up. That evening, Eleanor walked down to the town library carrying a small box wrapped in navy ribbon. Inside were Henry's journal, the preserved letter, and a copy of the newspaper article. She approached the librarian, a young man who had often helped her find old maps and poetry books. "I was wondering," she said softly, "if there's a place here for stories that weren't written in ink, but in footsteps, and silence, and loyalty." He looked at the items, then at Eleanor, understanding blooming in his eyes. "There's a veteran's memory wall being curated for Veterans Day. Would you let us include this?" Eleanor nodded, placing the box gently on the counter. "It's time his story belonged to more than just me." As she stepped outside, the library lights behind her glowing like candles, she felt something settle in her chest, not sorrow, not even peace, but purpose. Henry's legacy wasn't ending, it was opening, page by quiet page, for others to walk into. A few days later, Eleanor returned to her porch with 2 steaming mugs, one for herself, and one placed beside the empty chair where Henry used to sit. But this time, the silence wasn't heavy. It was full. She looked across the street where a boy was helping his grandfather rake leaves, their laughter rising like birdsong. Down the block, the mailman waved from his route, and for a moment, Eleanor saw Henry in all of them, in every act of quiet devotion. She opened the journal one last time and wrote beneath her final entry, "In every salute, every step, every cup left warm, I see you." Then she closed the cover, not as an ending, but as a beginning. Because some promises don't fade with time. They live on in those who carry them forward. If you've ever doubted whether love can echo through silence, listen closer. It's there, waiting in a gesture, a glance, or the steam rising from a forgotten cup.